Picture this: a biting wind howling through the skeletal trees, fields buried under a blanket of snow so deep it swallows footsteps whole. The air is so cold it steals your breath, and the sun, weak and pale, seems to give up before noon. This wasn't just a bad winter day for medieval farmers. It was months of unrelenting struggle, where every sunrise brought the same question: how do we survive until spring? No supermarkets, no electric heat, no machines to do the back-breaking work, just raw human ingenuity against nature's most brutal season. And yet, they did more than survive. They thrived. How? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. Think about the sheer scale of what these farmers were up against. Winters in medieval Europe weren't just inconvenient. They were life or death marathons. Crops froze, livestock starved, rivers turned to ice, cutting off trade routes. One bad harvest could doom entire villages. And yet, century after century, they found ways to outwit the cold, to stretch meager resources, to turn scarcity into sustenance. The secrets they uncovered weren't just about survival. They were about resilience, community, and a kind of cleverness that modern life has let us forget. So, what were those secrets? How did they store food without refrigerators? Heat homes without central heating? Keep their animals alive when the world seemed determined to freeze them out? The answers are hidden in the cracks of history, in the tools they forged, the traditions they passed down, and the unshakable determination that turned winter from a death sentence into just another season to conquer. This isn't just a story about farming. It's a story about human defiance. And by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a snowy day the same way again. Medieval winters weren't just cold. They were merciless. Imagine sunrise creeping in after 8 in the morning, only for twilight to descend by 3 in the afternoon. The sun, when it appeared at all, hung low and feeble, offering little warmth. Temperatures routinely plunged below freezing for months on end, turning dirt roads into icy ruts and thatched roofs into brittle, snow-laden traps. Historical records from monasteries and manor accounts paint a grim picture. Winters so severe that wine froze in barrels, birds fell dead from the sky mid-flight, and travelers were found lifeless just steps from their own front doors. In the winter of 762, the Rhine River froze solid for over 2 months, a phenomenon so rare it was seen as an omen. But for farmers, the real terror wasn't just the cold, it was the silence. Fields that had buzzed with life in summer now lay barren, the frozen earth unyielding to even the strongest hoe. Snowdrifts buried fences and smothered pastures, leaving livestock to gnaw bark from trees or starve. Grain stores, if not meticulously protected, became infested with rats or rotted by damp. And when the thaw finally came, it often brought floods, washing away topsoil and ruining any hope of an early planting. The chronicles of the Winchester Cathedral tell of the winter of 1342, when the frost lingered so long that spring crops couldn't be sown, leading to a famine that hollowed out entire villages. Yet what's most chilling isn't the weather, it's how ordinary these catastrophes were. For medieval peasants, a hard winter wasn't an anomaly. It was an expected trial, as routine as harvest season. The difference between survival and starvation often came down to preparation, and a brutal understanding of nature's indifference. When the first frost bit, everyone knew the race against time had begun. Survival didn't begin when the first snowflake fell. It started in the height of summer, when the sun blazed hottest and fields groaned under the weight of ripe grain. Medieval farmers knew winter's arrival was inevitable, and their entire year revolved around outsmarting it. The moment the harvest moon rose, villages transformed into whirlwinds of coordinated labor, every hand occupied with a single mission: stockpile, reinforce, preserve. Take the harvest timing was everything. A single storm could ruin a year's work, so farmers cut grain just as it reached peak ripeness, swinging sickles from dawn until their hands blistered. But reaping was only the first step. Grain had to be threshed, beaten to separate edible kernels from husks, then winnowed, tossed into the wind so chaff blew away like golden dust. This wasn't just farm work. It was alchemy, turning fragile stalks into durable lifelines. A single acre's yield could mean the difference between full bellies and famine by February. Preservation was next, and here medieval ingenuity shone. Without modern canning or freezing, farmers relied on age-old tricks. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were buried in sand-filled pits, where Earth's stable temperature kept them fresh for months. Fruits dried on rooftops or steeped in honey as primitive jam. Meat posed the biggest challenge. Salting was the answer. Layers of salt drew moisture out, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. A well-salted haunch of pork could last 2 years, becoming the centerpiece of sparse winter meals. And let's not forget dairy. Butter wasn't just churned. It was packed into barrels and submerged in peat bogs, where acidic, oxygen-poor water acted like a natural refrigerator. Archaeologists still find edible, bog butter today, centuries later. But food was only part of the equation. Tools had to be mended before frozen fingers made repairs impossible. Scythe blades were sharpened, plowshares reset, cartwheels soaked in water to swell the wood tight against iron rims. Homes got equal attention. Cracks in walls were stuffed with moss and mud to block drafts, while thatch roofs got extra layers, sometimes stolen from neighbors' stockpiles, sparking feuds that lasted generations. Even animals were part of the prep. Sheep were corralled closer to barns, their wool left unshorn for extra insulation, while chickens' combs were smeared with grease to prevent frostbite. The most remarkable thing, none of this happened alone. Harvest was a communal dance, with neighbors pitching in to reap each other's fields in exchange for meals of fresh bread and ale. When a barn needed raising before winter, the whole village arrived not out of charity, but shared survival. A lone family might starve. A village could redistribute resources, barter skills, and pool knowledge. This interdependence was winter's unwritten contract. Today's labor was tomorrow's insurance. Records from English manors show how formalized this was: farmers who skipped communal work fines equivalent to a week's wages. Yet beneath all this preparation lurked a brutal truth. No matter how careful the planning, nature always held the upper hand. A single missed step, grain stored slightly damp, a poorly patched roof, could cascade into disaster. That's why medieval farmers didn't just prepare for winter. They worshipped it in rituals, weaving superstition into strategy. The last sheaf of harvest was often shaped into a corn dolly, hung in homes as a charm against hunger. In Scandinavia, porridge was left outdoors as an offering to frost spirits. These weren't quaint traditions, they were psychological armor, a way to confront the unimaginable with something resembling control. By the time the first frost crunched underfoot, every resource had been counted, every weakness fortified. What looked like simple chores to us were acts of defiance to them, a declaration that they would not just endure winter, but bend it to their will. The real miracle wasn't that they survived. It's that they turned preparation into an art form, one that modern homesteaders still study today. Storing food wasn't just about putting supplies away. It was a high-stakes science, where one mistake could mean starvation by midwinter. Take root cellaring, a trick so effective we still use it today. Farmers would dig deep pits, sometimes lining them with straw or stones, then pack them with turnips, carrots, beets, anything that grew underground. The Earth's natural insulation kept temperatures just above freezing, slowing decay for months. In some regions, like the frost-heavy Alps, families carved cellars directly into hillsides, turning geography into a pantry. But timing was crucial. Harvest too late and vegetables would rot. Harvest too early and they'd shrivel. Manuscripts from 14th century England even specify the ideal moon phase for pulling roots, waning when sap was believed to retreat into the earth, making them less prone to spoilage. Then there was salting, the medieval equivalent of a life-saving superpower. A single cow could provide enough meat to last a family through winter, if preserved correctly. Butchers rubbed thick layers of salt into every crevice of beef, pork, or fish, then packed them into barrels with even more salt between layers. The process sucked out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. In coastal villages where salt was plentiful, fish like herring were preserved this way by the barrelful. But inland, where salt was expensive, it became currency itself. Tax records from Burgundy show peasants paying landlords in salt rather than coins, proof of its worth. Smoking added another layer of protection, especially for meats that needed to last beyond a few months. Hams and sausages hung for weeks in chimney alcoves, where constant exposure to wood smoke infused them with preservative chemicals like creosote. The result: meat that could endure years without refrigeration. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have found smoked reindeer meat still edible after centuries. But smoking wasn't just practical, it was flavorful. Peasants might not have known about phenols or antimicrobial compounds, but they knew oak smoked bacon tasted better than plain salted slabs, turning necessity into culinary craft. Fermentation, though, was the real game changer. Cabbages left to sour in crocks became sauerkraut, teeming with probiotics that kept gut health strong during nutrient-scarce months. In Eastern Europe, beet kvass, a fermented drink, provided vitamins when fresh produce was non-existent. Even grains got the treatment. Barley soaked and left to ferment turned into hearty, probiotic-rich porridges. And let's not forget ale. Brewing wasn't just about intoxication. The fermentation process made water safe to drink when icy streams were inaccessible, while the drink itself offered calories when food ran low. Monastery records from Germany show monks brewing small beer, weak, but hydrating specifically for winter consumption. Grains demanded their own careful rituals. Stored loose in a damp barn, they'd sprout or mold within weeks. The solution: granaries raised wooden structures perched on stilts to deter rodents, with slatted floors for airflow. In Norway, some farms built granaries with walls insulated by birch bark, which repelled insects. But the real genius was in the details. Grain was often stored as whole sheaves, not threshed kernels, because the husks acted as natural barriers against moisture. Only when needed would families thresh small batches, ensuring most stayed protected. And if pests still broke in, they'd drop cuts into the granary's medieval pest control with teeth. Dairy posed perhaps the trickiest challenge. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled within days, so farmers turned it into longer-lasting forms. Cheese pressed into wheels and aged in cool cellars, or butter buried in bogs, as we saw earlier. In Iceland, they went further, crafting skyr, a fermented yogurt so dense it could last months. And in the Alps, milk was reduced to a solid block called hartkes, literally hard cheese, which travelers could carry for weeks without it spoiling. What's startling isn't just the variety of methods, but how finely tuned they were to local conditions. Coastal villages smoked fish because sea winds accelerated drying. Mountain communities fermented milk because alpine cold stalled bacterial growth. Every technique was a dialogue with the environment, a way of bending nature's rules without breaking them. And when winter finally relented, the proof was in the survival, not just of people, but of traditions. Some of these methods, like sauerkraut or smoked salmon, still grace our tables today, silent tributes to medieval ingenuity. Grains were more than just food. They were lifelines woven into the very fabric of medieval survival. Picture a peasant's daily meal, and you'd likely see a thick, coarse loaf of bread at its center. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats weren't just crops. They were currency, insurance, and sometimes the only barrier between a family and starvation. But turning golden fields into something edible through winter was a feat of engineering as much as agriculture. First came the storage challenge. Unlike root vegetables or salted meat, grain was notoriously finicky. Too damp and it sprouted or molded, too warm and insects devoured it. The solution: granaries built like fortresses. Raised on stilts to deter rodents, these wooden structures featured slatted floors for airflow, keeping moisture at bay. In northern Europe, some farmers lined granary walls with birch bark, a natural insect repellent. And grain wasn't just dumped inside. It was often stored as whole sheaves, husks intact, to protect the kernels. Only when needed would families thresh small batches, ensuring the bulk stayed safe. Milling was the next hurdle. Without electricity, grinding grain meant relying on water wheels, windmills, or back-breaking hand querns. But here's the catch: mills were rarely owned by peasants. Lords controlled them, charging tolls for use. Records from feudal England show villagers giving up 1 sack of flour in every 20 just to access the mill, a steep price when every ounce counted. Some risked punishment by using hidden hand mills, though getting caught meant heavy fines. Bread wasn't just baked. It was earned through layers of labor and oppression. Then came the baking itself. Medieval bread wasn't the fluffy, white loaves we know today. Peasants ate maslin, a dense mix of rye and wheat, or barley and oats, baked dark to hide impurities. Wealthier households might enjoy pure wheat bread, but for most, even a pebble or chaff in a bite was normal. Bread was so central that it doubled as tableware stale slices called trenchers held stews, absorbing flavors before being eaten or given to dogs. But grain's fragility made it a constant source of anxiety. A wet harvest season could rot crops in the field. Poor storage invited rats or mildew. And when supplies ran low, desperation set in. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 describe peasants eating bark, grass, even clay to fill their stomachs. In extreme cases, grain stores became targets. Raiders sacked barns, and hungry mobs stormed monastery granaries. The difference between order and chaos often rested on a village's grain reserves. Perhaps the cruelest twist: grain shortages weren't just natural disasters, they were political weapons. Lords hoarded surpluses to drive up prices. Armies requisitioned supplies, leaving farmers to starve. During the Baltic famine of 1314, merchants exported rye to wealthier regions while locals perished. Bread riots erupted across Europe, with bakers' shops looted and tax collectors chased out of villages. Grain wasn't just food, it was power, and its scarcity exposed society's fractures. Yet through all this, bread remained sacred. Church altars displayed it as the body of Christ. Oaths were sworn on loaves. In Scandinavia, tradition held that dropping bread required kissing it to ward off bad luck. Even in the depths of famine, the idea of wasting a crumb was unthinkable. Every bite carried the weight of a year's labor. the ploughing, sowing, reaping, milling and baking that stood between survival and ruin. To understand medieval bread is to understand resilience itself, coarse, imperfect, but sustaining life against all odds. Keeping livestock alive through winter wasn't just about shelter. It was a high-stakes calculation of calories, space, and mercy. Every animal represented months of labor. The sheep that grew wool for cloaks, the oxen needed for spring ploughing, the hens that laid precious eggs. But winter turned these assets into liabilities, each mouth consuming scarce food while producing little in return. The solution, a brutal calculus of triage, where survival wasn't measured in individual lives, but in the cold arithmetic of community survival. Sheltering came first. Cattle and sheep were brought into the very homes of their owners in some regions, sharing the smoky warmth of peasant cottages. Archaeologists have found homes with partitioned, byres, animal quarters separated by low walls, where body heat from livestock helped warm human living spaces. In wealthier estates, specialized barns had sloped floors for easy mucking, with overhead haylofts feeding directly into mangers. But warmth brought danger. Confined animals breathing in poorly ventilated spaces risked fog fever, a lethal pneumonia recorded in medieval veterinary texts. The solution, smoky fires of damp straw, believed to purify the air, though we now know the creosote acted as a crude antiseptic. Feeding strategies bordered on genius. Haymaking wasn't just summer work, it was a race against time. Grass cut too early lacked nutrients, too late, and it turned woody and indigestible. The best hay came from meadows grazed lightly in spring, allowing diverse grasses to flourish. Once cut, it was dried on wooden racks called haystles, turned constantly to prevent mold. A single cow could eat 2 tons of hay over winter, meaning a typical farm needed stacks taller than a man. In alpine regions, hay was so precious it was hauled up cliffs to inaccessible storage huts, safe from thieving hands. But hay alone wasn't enough. Peasants supplemented with tree hay, branches of ash, elm, or birch, dried in summer and stored like leafy bouquets. Bark was scraped from felled trees as emergency fodder. Even the straw from grain harvests found use. Though it was barely nutritious, farmers soaked it in brine or sprinkled it with crushed peas to make it palatable. The most desperate resorted to feeding animals heather, sawdust, or even wool clippings, though manuscripts warn this caused the bloody flux. Selective slaughter was the cruelest necessity. Come Martinmas November 11th, the air across Europe smelled of smoke and blood. Any animal unlikely to survive winter was butchered, its meat preserved while still fresh. Young bull calves, elderly sheep, pigs too lean to fatten, all went under the knife. This wasn't waste, it was conservation. Keeping a sickly cow alive until spring might mean 5 healthy ones starved. But the choices were agonizing. Court rolls from Yorkshire show a farmer fined for slaughtering a lord's breeding sow, proving even hunger had laws. Dairy animals posed special dilemmas. A cow kept alive for milk might need more food than her output justified. The compromise: keep just enough milkers to supply children and the sick, drying the rest off early. Goats, hardier but less valued, often survived on scraps milkless through winter. And chickens, those that stopped laying, were first into the pot, though some clever souls tied feathers to sticks as dummy roosters, believing it spurred hens to lay longer. The true test came in late winter when stores ran low and animals grew gaunt. This was when traditions turned sacrificial. In Scandinavia, farmers bled cattle just enough to make blood bread without killing them, a protein boost in the leanest months. Welsh herdsmen practiced transhumance, driving cattle to lowland pastures months before spring. even if it meant trespassing on enemy lands. And everywhere, people watched for the first sprouting of Lenten roses hellebores, knowing their emergence meant fresh grazing was weeks away. What seems brutal today was simply survival then. A 14th century shepherd didn't mourn the culling of weak lambs. He knew it strengthened the flock. The ethics weren't about individual lives, but collective endurance. Modern ranchers might shudder at medieval methods, but they achieved what mattered most. When spring's first green appeared, there were still animals alive to taste it. That was victory enough. Salt wasn't just a seasoning in medieval winters. It was the thread holding survival together. Imagine a world where a single barrel of salt could mean the difference between feasting and famine. This humble mineral acted as a time machine, suspending meat and fish in edible stasis for months, even years. The process was deceptively simple. Thick layers of salt drew moisture out, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. A well-cured ham wasn't just food. It was a victory over decay itself. But the true magic lay in the details. In coastal regions, herring were packed in alternating layers with salt in barrels, a method so effective that Baltic traders built fortunes exporting salt gold across Europe. Inland, where salt was scarcer, farmers meticulously rubbed mixtures of salt and crushed juniper berries into pork, adding antimicrobial power to preservation. The trade routes tell the story of salt's worth. Caravans of merchants hauled blocks of rock salt from mines in Austria, and Poland along routes patrolled by armed guards. In Venice, the salt monopoly funded an empire, with taxes on its trade propping up the city's grandeur. Medieval ledgers from France reveal salt prices fluctuating wildly during harsh winters. A bushel could cost more than a peasant's monthly wages. This wasn't just commerce, it was life insurance. Towns like Lüneburg in Germany grew wealthy from their saline springs, while in West Africa, salt was traded ounce for ounce with gold. The Salzstrasse, or salt roads, became arteries of survival, connecting producers to starving hinterlands. But when salt ran short, desperation followed. Chronicles from the famine of 1310 describe villages resorting to burning salt-rich seaweed for its ashes, or leaching nitrous soil to extract trace minerals. In landlocked regions, butchers reused salt until it turned black with blood, risking botulism for lack of alternatives. The consequences were dire: meat spoiled, winter stores rotted, and hunger gnawed harder. During the Great Frost of 1608, Scottish Highlanders reportedly ate unsalted, putrid beef anywhere, a gamble between starvation and sickness. Salt shortages didn't just mean bland meals. They unraveled the very systems that kept societies intact. Yet salt's power went beyond practicality. It was currency, ritual, even rebellion. In Poland, landlords paid serfs with salt, knowing it held more value than coins. In Brittany, brides carried salt in their shoes for luck, while English farmers sprinkled it on ploughs to bless the harvest. And when kings taxed salt too heavily, like the infamous Gay Bell in France, it sparked riots that toppled regimes. The salt tax became a symbol of oppression, proving that control of preservation was control of life itself. What medieval people understood, and we've forgotten, is that salt wasn't just a tool. It was a pact with time, a way to cheat the seasons. Every salted fish, every cured ham, was a defiance of nature's limits. Modern food science has given us freezers and preservatives, but the principle remains. Survival has always hinged on stretching today's abundance into tomorrow's certainty. The next time you reach for a salt shaker, remember, you're holding the mineral that built empires and staved off apocalypse. Few substances have carried so much weight in so small a grain. Even in the depths of winter, medieval farmers weren't entirely at nature's mercy. Hidden beneath straw and dung, a quiet agricultural rebellion was taking place: hotbeds. These weren't glass greenhouses as we know them today, but ingenious pits of decomposing manure that generated enough heat to coax life from frozen ground. Picture a rectangular trench about knee-deep, crammed with fresh horse manure mixed with straw. As the manure decomposed, chemical reactions sent temperatures soaring, sometimes reaching 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even while snow piled up around it. This wasn't just warmth, it was a microclimate, a pocket of summer carefully hoarded against the cold. The most common crops grown this way were quick-growing greens: spinach, mustard, cress, and hardy herbs like parsley and chervil. These weren't calorie crops meant to fill bellies, but nutritional lifelines, sources of vitamins to stave off scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Monastery gardens took hotbeds to another level, cultivating medicinal plants like feverfew or lavender year-round. The key was timing. Seeds were sown in late autumn, just as the manure's heat peaked, giving seedlings a head start before the deepest frosts. But the real marvel was the engineering. Farmers didn't just toss manure into a hole, they layered it with precision. A base of coarse straw allowed airflow, preventing the pile from going anaerobic and rotting instead of heating. The manure itself had to be fresh, ideally from grain-fed horses, as their diet produced the most consistent heat. Some accounts describe alternating layers of manure and leaves to extend the thermal effect, like a medieval battery storing warmth. And when nighttime temperatures plummeted, gardeners covered the beds with straw mats or wooden shutters, primitive insulation, to trap every degree of precious heat. Hotbeds also reveal medieval Europe's surprising global connections. Wealthier estates grew exotic plants like lemons or oranges this way, their seeds brought back by crusaders from the Middle East. In England, the Bishop of Winchester's garden reportedly grew figs in hotbeds, a luxury that defied the local climate. And in Burgundy, vineyards used hotbeds to start early grapevines, ensuring a longer growing season. This wasn't just subsistence farming. It was experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what could survive beyond its natural habitat. The labor involved was immense. Maintaining a hotbed meant turning the manure weekly to redistribute heat, hauling water that wouldn't freeze the tender roots, and vigilantly patching any gaps in insulation. Peasants who couldn't afford dedicated gardeners sometimes slept near their hotbeds, ready to adjust covers if frost threatened. But the payoff was worth it: a February harvest of fresh greens when neighbors were down to salted cabbage and grain porridge. In a world where winter meals were monotonous at best, these small patches of green weren't just food, they were hope. What's most striking is how these methods mirror modern sustainable farming. Today's compost-heated greenhouses owe their design to medieval hotbeds, proving that innovation isn't always about new technology. Sometimes it's about rediscovering old wisdom. When we bite into a winter salad, we're tasting the legacy of farmers who refused to believe that snow had the final word. Wool was more than just fabric to medieval farmers. It was their first line of defense against winter's knife-edged winds. Unlike modern synthetic layers, medieval clothing worked with the body's natural rhythms. The secret lay in lanolin, the oily substance sheep produce that stays embedded in unwashed wool. This made peasant tunics and hose naturally water-resistant, shedding snow and repelling light rain. But warmth wasn't just about material, it was about strategy. Farmers wore tunics with deliberately loose weaves, creating tiny air pockets that trapped body heat like primitive thermal insulation. Surviving garments from Swedish bog finds show repairs with multiple fabric layers at stress points: elbows, knees, proving these weren't just clothes, but engineered survival gear. Layering was an art form long before modern outdoor brands existed. A typical farmer's winter outfit might start with a linen undershirt, chosen not for warmth, but for its ability to wick sweat away from the skin. Over this went a woolen tunic, often quilted with raw fleece or down feathers scavenged from wild birds. The wealthier might own a gudel, a fitted hood with a tail that could be wrapped around the neck like a medieval scarf. But the real innovation was in the details. Sleeves were intentionally roomy to allow air circulation, while preventing dampness from freezing against the skin. Extant mittens from German excavations reveal wool felted so tightly it repelled wind, yet lined with rabbit fur for dexterity when handling tools. Footwear posed unique challenges. Leather boots lined with straw or hay were common, but farmers working in snow often resorted to winningers, long woolen strips wound tightly from ankle to knee. These leg wraps prevented snow from slipping into footwear, while improving circulation, critical for preventing frostbite during hours of fieldwork. Some Nordic farmers wore bark shoes stuffed with moss, a disposable option when leather froze stiff. And in the wettest regions, they slathered their foot wraps in animal fat, creating a crude waterproof barrier. Women's clothing doubled as storage. Aprons with deep pockets held seed samples or kindling, while the space between overdress and underdress became makeshift pouches for carrying eggs or warm stones from the hearth. Children were bundled in oversized hand-me-downs with sleeves knotted to prevent dragging, their mobility sacrificed for warmth. Textile fragments from English midden heaps show colorful dyes, madder root red, woad blue, proving even peasants resisted winter's gloom with splashes of defiant brightness. The true test came during outdoor labor. Plowing frozen fields required clothing that balanced warmth with flexibility. Farmers working livestock wore thick felted cloaks, short in front, to avoid tangling in tools, long in back to sit on during brief rests. Shepherds favored sleeveless wool surcoats that allowed arm movement while protecting torsos from wind. And everyone understood the golden rule: never stop moving. Sweat was the enemy. Once damp, wool lost its insulating properties, making laborers vulnerable to hypothermia. Accounts from monastic infirmaries describe field workers stripped of frozen garments, their skin peeling away with the fabric, a grim reminder of the stakes. Innovation flourished where need was greatest. In the Scottish Highlands, farmers wove heather into their cloaks for extra insulation. Alpine herdsmen developed loden cloth, wool pounded wet to create an almost waterproof felt. And everywhere, people slept in their clothes, often sharing beds with livestock for shared warmth. These weren't fashion choices. They were calculated adaptations, refined through generations of trial and fatal error. When we zip up a modern winter coat, we're enjoying centuries of peasant ingenuity, each stitch a hard-won victory against the cold. Firewood wasn't just fuel, it was survival currency, measured in frozen fingers and aching backs. In a world without central heating, the difference between life and death often came down to how well a family managed their woodpile. But gathering enough to last the winter was a brutal race against time. From the moment autumn's first chill set in, entire villages turned their attention to the forests, axes biting into bark before the ground froze too hard to work. The math was unforgiving. A typical peasant household needed at least 10 cords of wood to make it through winter. That's a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 80 feet long. And that was just for basic warmth. Blacksmiths, bakers, and brewers needed triple that amount. Not all wood burned equal. Medieval farmers knew what modern campers rediscover. Hardwoods like oak and beech burned slow and hot, while softwoods like pine spat sparks and vanished too quickly. But peasant access to quality timber was limited, noble forests were often off limits, patrolled by armed foresters who levied heavy fines for illegal cutting. Court records from Normandy tell of villagers sneaking into woods at night, their saws muffled with rags to avoid detection. Some got creative. In England, the right to gather windfall branches broken off by storms was fiercely contested, with families guarding their designated patches like treasure. Storage was another battle. Wood had to be split and dried for months to burn efficiently. Green wood smoked terribly and provided little heat. Thatched roofs often sheltered woodpiles, but damp winters could still ruin carefully stacked reserves. The poorest resorted to burning whatever they could scavenge: hedge trimmings, dung mixed with straw, even the wooden handles of broken tools when desperation set in. During the Great Frost of 1608, Londoners reportedly burned their furniture and floorboards, while in rural areas, fences disappeared plank by plank under cover of darkness. Where trees were scarce, peat became the unsung hero of winter survival. Across the boggy landscapes of Ireland, Scotland, and the Low Countries, families spent summers cutting peat bricks from waterlogged earth. These dense, fibrous blocks dried slowly in the sun, transforming into slow-burning fuel that could smolder for hours. But peat harvesting was grueling work, knee-deep in freezing water, swinging special turf spades to cut precise rectangular bricks. The smell of burning peat was distinctive, earthy and pungent, but so was its value. Irish monastic records show peat rents being paid to landowners, measured in precise stacks of 20 bricks. Access to fuel revealed medieval societies' stark hierarchies. While peasants huddled around smoky hearths, manor houses blazed with fires in every room. The wealthy burned seasoned hardwood shipped from distant forests, while monasteries maintained elaborate woodlots managed by lay brothers. In some regions, the right to gather fallen branches was a taxable privilege. The infamous Tallage de Bois in France sparked riots when collectors grew too greedy. Even within families, warmth was rationed. Children and elders slept closest to the hearth, while servants took the chilliest corners. The true ingenuity lay in making every spark count. Fire dogs, iron hearth supports elevated logs for better airflow, while cleverly designed smoke hoods funneled heat back into rooms instead of escaping through thatch. In the alpine regions, farmers built cachalurfen, massive ceramic stoves that radiated heat for hours after the fire died down. And when fuel ran critically low, people turned to shared warmth, whole villages gathering in churches or barns for communal heat, a practice so common it appears in medieval illustrations as clusters of figures wrapped in cloaks, breathing steam into frigid air. The legacy of these struggles lingers in our language. Phrases like "burning the candle at both ends" or "don't have a leg to stand on" trace back to fuel poverty. When we flip a thermostat switch today, we're bypassing centuries of human ingenuity and forgetting how recently warmth was something you fought for, piece by precious piece. Winter didn't just test individual households, it exposed the strength of entire villages. When the first heavy snows blocked paths and isolated farms, survival became a collective effort, governed by unwritten rules older than feudalism itself. Neighbors didn't just share food, they shared risk, rotating guard shifts to watch grain stores against rats and thieves, pooling meager milk yields for communal cheese making, even bleeding sick animals together to divine whether illness threatened the entire herd. This wasn't charity, it was bioeconomic strategy. A single family's cow dying might mean 10 households lost their butter supply, while one failed grain store invited famine for all. The manor lord played a complex role in this delicate balance. Though often portrayed as an oppressor, his winter duties were shockingly hands-on. Manorial court rolls from 14th century England reveal lords distributing seed grain to tenants after harsh winters, delaying rent payments during famines, even organizing mass hunts to cull deer threatening winter pastures. Why such generosity, practicality? A dead peasant couldn't work next year's fields. Some lords maintained famine reserves, granaries stocked beyond their own needs, opened when crops failed. But these safety nets came at a cost. Stricter labor obligations, tighter control over marriage and movement, loans that bound families to generations of debt. Survival was never free. Villages developed intricate systems to prevent cheating the communal pact. In alpine regions, families deposited equal portions of cheese and smoked meat into a shared winter cellar, with wooden tallies tracking withdrawals. German door-fringe village rings assigned households rotating duties. One family tended the communal bread oven, another repaired roofs, others chopped firewood for widows. Failure to contribute meant exclusion from the next seasons. Shared plough team a death sentence in all but name. Festivals became covert redistribution mechanisms. The Christmas Lord of Misrule tradition wasn't just fun. It inverted hierarchies, allowing peasants to tax the manor's pantry through raucous demands for feasts. In Scandinavia, Jul celebrations required landlords to provide ale and meat to all tenants, ensuring even the poorest got protein during the year's darkest days. Records show some lords grumbling about these customary rights, but none dared refuse tradition held more power than any law. The true test came during crises. When the winter of 1332 froze the Baltic solid, trapping grain ships, villages near Lübeck instituted a bread census. Every household declared their reserves daily, with bakers redistricting flour accordingly. In the Pyrenees, shepherds developed a rotating pasture system, driving flocks between valleys so no single area's resources were depleted. These weren't government programs. They emerged organically from generations of trial and error, proving that communal survival required both cooperation and ruthless pragmatism. What's startling isn't that these systems existed, it's how fragile they were. A single bad apple, one family hoarding grain or skipping firewood duty, could unravel the entire village safety net. Court records brim with cases of night thieves, stealing neighbors' hay, or hearth cheats, sneaking extra embers from communal ovens. The punishments were brutal: fines, public shaming, sometimes banishment because the stakes were existential. Yet within this harsh framework, flickers of unexpected kindness shine through. Parish account books list anonymous gifts of wool to shivering babes, while wills show elderly peasants leaving their last sacks of barley to orphan children. A farmer might grumble about sharing his last turnips, but he'd also sit up nights with a sick neighbor's livestock, knowing tomorrow the roles could reverse. Winter taught medieval villagers a paradoxical truth. Survival demanded both unyielding discipline and radical interdependence. Their legacy lingers in our own crisis responses. When storms hit or pandemics strike, we still rediscover that ancient equation where individual survival is ultimately bound to the communal whole. In the dead of winter, when streams froze solid and wells crusted over with ice, medieval farmers turned to an unexpected lifeline: beer. But this wasn't the potent ale of tavern tales. It was a thin, low-alcohol brew nicknamed small beer or liquid bread, a staple as essential as firewood or salted meat. Clocking in at around 1 to 2% alcohol, weaker than modern light beer. It served a dual purpose: hydration when water sources were unsafe, and precious calories when food grew scarce. Brewing wasn't just a craft, it was survival chemistry, transforming barren winter months into a season of fermentation. The process began with what farmers had in abundance: grain. Barley, oats, or even leftover bread, anything with fermentable sugars, could be tossed into the mix. Unlike today's precise brewing schedules, medieval beer was a pragmatic affair. Grains were soaked in warm water to coax out sugars, then drained and left to germinate just enough to convert starches before drying halted the process. This malt was then boiled with water, and whatever herbs were on hand, hops, weren't universally used until later centuries. So rosemary, yarrow, or bog myrtle often flavored the brew. The result, a mildly alcoholic, porridge-like liquid strained through woven reed filters. But why winter? Cold weather offered unexpected advantages. Wild yeast, ever unpredictable in summer heat, behaved more steadily in cool temperatures, reducing the risk of sour batches. Cellars and outbuildings, too cold for most chores, became ideal fermentation chambers. And with fieldwork halted, families had time for the labor-intensive process. Brewing was often women's work, passed down through generations like a culinary heirloom. Household records from English manors show a flurry of brewing activity between November and February, with batches timed to mature by the depths of winter. The nutritional math was ingenious. A quart of small beer provided roughly 200 calories, a lifeline for laborers burning energy, just to stay warm. Children drank it diluted, while field hands carried it in leather flasks to sip during work, avoiding dehydration without risking intoxication. Monks took the science further, brewing double beers with extra grain for fasting seasons. When solid food was forbidden, liquid bread kept them nourished. Excavations at monastic sites reveal massive lead-lined vats capable of brewing hundreds of gallons at once, a testament to beer's role as edible infrastructure. Yet beer's true power lay in its social function. Brew days were communal events, with neighbors sharing equipment and trading yeast strains like currency. In Scandinavia, the vinteröl winter beer was so revered that laws mandated its brewing for midwinter feasts. Failed batches weren't wasted, sour beer became vinegar for preserving vegetables, while dregs thickened soups. Even the grain left after brewing, spent and soggy, was fed to livestock or baked into dense, brewer's bread, squeezing every calorie from the harvest. This ingenuity had dark edges, though. When crops failed, brewing halted, leaving communities without safe hydration. Chronicles from the Great Famine describe peasants drinking from polluted streams, sparking dysentery outbreaks. And while beer was safer than water, over-reliance could mask malnutrition. Grain-heavy diets, lacking in vitamins, led to diseases like pellagra, where skin cracked like parched earth. Still, beer's legacy endures in our very language. Bridal comes from bride ale, the wedding brew that sealed alliances, while alehouses were medieval social hubs centuries before pubs existed. What medieval brewers understood, and we've largely forgotten, is that fermentation wasn't just about intoxication. It was about harnessing biology to defy scarcity. Every bubbling barrel was a defiance of winter's grip, turning barren fields into nourishment, one sip at a time. Next time you raise a glass, remember, you're tasting an ancient act of resilience, brewed not for pleasure, but for survival. When the cold tightened its grip and hunger gnawed at village doors, the medieval church became more than a place of worship. It transformed into the social safety net of its age. Monasteries and parish churches didn't just offer prayers. They kept ledgers of hunger, tracking which families had enough and who teetered on the edge. During the harshest months, these institutions became logistical hubs, organizing the collection and redistribution of food with a precision that would rival modern aid networks. Tithes, the tenth of all harvests owed to the church, weren't just spiritual dues. They were literal grain reserves piled high in monastery storehouses, earmarked for the starving. Records from Canterbury Cathedral show monks calculating down to the last bushel how much barley could be spared for the lean months, balancing piety with pragmatism. But charity wasn't random. It followed strict hierarchies of need. Widows and orphans ate first, their portions distributed at the church door every St. Martin's Day. The elderly and infirm came next, with parish priests secretly slipping extra rations to those too proud to beg. Even the sturdy beggars, able-bodied peasants between jobs, received day bread in exchange for chopping firewood or repairing cloister roofs. This wasn't pure altruism. The church understood that desperation bred unrest. A satiated peasant was less likely to raid manor granaries or question divine order. Winter feasts like Christmas and Twelfth Night served dual purposes. Yes, they celebrated faith, but they were also psychological lifelines, strategically timed to break winter's monotony right when morale hit its lowest. The Lord of Misrule tradition, where peasants temporarily overturned social hierarchies, wasn't just fun and games. By allowing controlled chaos servants demanding ale from masters, children playfully taxing the wealthy, the church released pent-up tensions that might otherwise explode into real rebellion. And the food, it was a calculated spectacle. Roast boar, spiced wine, and honeyed fruits weren't just decadent. They were edible propaganda, proving that abundance could return if people endured a little longer. Monasteries took feast science further. Benedictine rules required 2 cooked dishes daily, even in winter, not just for monks, but for all guests. This hospitality wasn't casual, it was marketing. When travelers spread tales of warm abbey kitchens, donations flowed in. Some monasteries even bred special Christmas pigs, fattened on acorns and brewery scraps, their slaughter timed to dazzle visitors with fresh meat when the rest of Europe gnawed on salted stockfish. The message was clear. Faith brought tangible rewards, yet the church's power came with shadows. Charity often carried strings, expectations of tithe, payments come spring, or pressure to abandon pagan winter traditions. In Sweden, priests smashed loaves of frost bread, left outdoors to appease winter spirits, replacing them with sanctified wafers, and those feast day gifts. Manor lords deducted them from peasants' future wages, turning generosity into debt. The church didn't just feed the hungry, it reminded them who held the keys to survival, both earthly and divine. What's fascinating isn't just the system's scale, but its contradictions. The same monasteries that distributed alms also hoarded grain for profit. The feasts that uplifted spirits also reinforced hierarchies. This was winter survival as theatre, where bread and pageantry wove together into something greater than sustenance. They became the fragile glue holding society together when the ice threatened to crack it apart. When the nights grew long and the cold seeped into bones, medieval farmers didn't just rely on salt and hay. They turned to older, deeper wisdom. The flicker of candlelight cast shadows that weren't just empty darkness. They were alive with spirits and signs. Take the humble onion, for example. In villages across Germany and England, families would slice an onion in half at midnight on Christmas Eve, counting the layers to predict the winter's remaining fury. 12 moist rings meant 12 more weeks of cold, a primitive almanac carved in vegetable flesh, and if the onion's center was dry, that was worse than any storm cloud. It signaled death coming to the household before spring. Livestock rituals bordered on sacred theatre. In Scandinavia, farmers would lead their animals in procession around the farmstead while holding burning juniper branches, the smoke believed to form an invisible shield against evil spirits. The moment a cow faltered or sneezed during the circuit was read like an omen. That creature wouldn't survive the season. Some went further, dipping crosses made from rowan twigs into holy water and hanging them over barn doors. The rowan tree was thought to repel witches, who were blamed for souring milk or stealing calves' breath on icy nights. Records from witch trials in Scotland even cite these charms as proof of demonic interference when livestock mysteriously died. Predicting winter's severity became a cottage industry of its own. In the Alps, shepherds studied the thickness of hazelnut shells. The harder the shell, the harsher the coming cold. Welsh fishermen watched the behavior of migrating geese. If they flew low and frantic, it meant early snows. But the most widespread belief centered on the feast of St. Martin, November 11th. If the weather was mild that day, a brutal winter was guaranteed. Martinmas summer wasn't a gift, it was nature's deceit, lulling farmers into complacency before the hammer fell. Manuscripts from French monasteries show monks meticulously recording St. Martin's Day weather for centuries, creating what we'd now call the first climate databases. Some superstitions crossed into sheer desperation. In Bohemia, families buried a live rooster at the crossroads during the winter solstice, believing its muffled crowing would confuse malevolent spirits into passing by their homes. Eastern European peasants sprinkled their thresholds with iron nails or sickle blades to cut the cold's advance. Even snow itself was read like a text. Fluffy, light flakes meant a short winter, while granular, hard pellets signaled months of suffering. The logic was circular. If a harsh winter came, people remembered the signs that predicted it. If it didn't, those same signs were forgotten. But beneath these rituals lay a profound psychological truth: control. When frost killed seedlings or wolves picked off sheep, reason offered no comfort. Superstition did. Hanging a holly branch over the cradle might not ward off illness, but it gave parents the illusion of agency. Knocking 3 times on the frozen well before drawing water didn't melt the ice, but it made the wait feel purposeful. These weren't just folk tales, they were coping mechanisms, refined over generations of helplessness. The Church fought a losing battle against such practices. Priests condemned weather witches, who claimed to delay frosts with incantations, yet quietly adopted their own versions, blessing fields with holy water or prescribing prayers to St. Bridget for dairy animals. In Ireland, the line between pagan and Christian blurred completely. Crosses woven from rushes were hung in byres, not just as symbols of faith, but because their intricate knots were thought to trap misfortune. The Church might call it divine protection, but to the farmer, the result mattered more than the theology. Perhaps the most haunting survival ritual was the hunger stone. Along rivers like the Elbe, villagers would carve dates and warnings into boulders only visible when water levels dropped drastically. The stone uncovered in 2018 bore the inscription, "If you see me, weep." These weren't prophecies, they were histories. Each etching marked a past famine, a collective memory set in stone to warn future generations. When the river ran low enough to reveal them, it meant winter stores were already dwindling, and hunger walked closer than anyone wanted to admit. What separates us from these medieval minds isn't rationality, but the luxury of predictability. We check weather apps, not onion rings. But when the power fails during a blizzard or a pandemic empties grocery shelves, we grasp for rituals too, hoarding toilet paper, knocking on wood, counting the days until equinox. Superstition isn't ignorance. It's the human brain insisting that even in chaos, patterns must exist. Those farmers whispering charms over their livestock weren't so different from us. They just had colder winters and far fewer illusions. The frozen earth of winter didn't just slow medieval farmers. It demanded entirely new tools, each one a masterclass in adaptation. Take the humble plough, for example. Summer's curved blade, designed to slice through soft soil, would shatter against frost-hardened ground, so blacksmiths reforged them with heavier, flatter shares, sometimes even tipping them with iron strips to skid across icy crusts rather than dig into it. But brute force wasn't the answer. Frozen soil clung like stone. Farmers learned to wait for the brief midday thaw when the top layer softened just enough to crack open, harnessing oxen to drag modified ploughs in short, furious bursts before the earth locked solid again. Manuscript illustrations from Flanders show teams of horses fitted with special snowshoes, wide wooden platforms lashed to their hooves to prevent them from sinking into drifts while pulling these winterized ploughs. Shoveling snow wasn't the occasional chore we think of today. It was daily survival. But medieval shovels were nothing like our lightweight aluminum versions. They were hewn from single slabs of oak or ash, with edges reinforced by fire hardening or metal bands. Some had peculiar curved handles, designed to lever snow sideways with minimal lifting, sparing overworked backs. In alpine regions, farmers used snow beaters, long poles with flattened ends to tamp down drifts into walkable paths. And when ice choked watermills or blocked streams, out came the icebreakers' massive iron hooks mounted on poles, swung like axes to fracture frozen surfaces. The real innovation wasn't in the tools themselves, but in their improvisation. Hay rakes doubled as snow combs to clear thatch roofs before their weight collapsed homes. Flails for threshing grain became ice smashers for breaking up frozen troughs. Even clothing got repurposed. Woolen sacks, tied over boots, acted as makeshift snowshoes for shepherds checking flocks. And in the worst blizzards, farmers strung ropes between house and barn like lifelines, gripping them to navigate whiteouts without vanishing into drifts. Some tools blurred the line between practical and prophetic. In the Alps, farmers used frost nails, iron spikes, driven into pathways believing the metal drew cold into itself and spared the ground around it. Did it work? Not scientifically, but the ritual of hammering them in before the first snow gave psychological relief, a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Other adaptations were ruthlessly effective. Norwegian farmers wrapped their plough blades in salted rags to prevent ice buildup, while Russian peasants greased them with pork fat for smoother gliding. Every solution, whether rooted in superstition or pragmatism, carried the same message. Winter wouldn't be waited out. It had to be fought, tool by stubborn tool. The most fascinating adaptations weren't tools at all, but changes to the body itself. Generations of winter labor bred physical traits. Swedish farmers developed a distinctive stoop from years of shoveling low, while Scottish herdsmen's hands grew broader from gripping icy ropes. Calluses became living gloves, thickened skin resisting frost, bite better than any mitten. These weren't just tools against snow. They were the slow, unyielding evolution of humans hardening themselves to match their landscape. When we look at a modern snowblower or heated shovel, we're seeing the end of a chain that began with farmers staring down winter and whispering, "I'll need a better way." Winter was always a gamble, but some years the dice came up bones. When preparations failed or the cold outstayed its welcome, medieval villages didn't just face hunger. They stared down full-scale famine, where the rules of civilization crumbled like stale bread. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wasn't an anomaly. It was the nightmare scenario every farmer feared. It began with rains torrential, unrelenting downpours that drowned summer crops in the field. Grain sprouted still on the stalk, turning to inedible mush. Then winter arrived early, freezing what little harvest remained solid in storage pits. By January, even the rats grew desperate. gnawing through leather sacks and wooden barrels to get at the last kernels. Parish records from Norfolk describe families boiling wallpaper, glue from barn timbers for sustenance, their bellies swollen with emptiness. The societal unraveling was swift and merciless. With no surplus to tax, lords clamped down harder, demanding labor instead of grain peasants, forced to dig ditches or repair roads in exchange for meager rations. Court rolls show a surge in theft prosecutions. A handful of barley stolen from a neighbor's loft, a chicken snatched mid-roost. Punishments grew grotesquely inventive. Thieves were branded with images of the food they'd taken, their crimes etched into their flesh. In Ireland, where the famine hit hardest, clans turned on each other, raiding monastic granges for salted fish and honey. The annals of Connaught report warriors boiling their leather shields into broth when nothing else remained. Children were the most vulnerable. Skeletal remains from London plague pits reveal stunted growth lines in bones, evidence of winters where malnutrition halted development entirely. Some parents resorted to abandoning infants at monastery gates. Praying monks would take them in. Others sold children outright. A Bristol merchant's ledger from 1316 lists a girl traded for half a bushel of rye and 2 salted herrings. The church called it charity, the parents called it survival, but the cruelest twist: famines altered landscapes for generations. Starving villagers ate not just their food stores, but their future, seed grain meant for planting, breeding livestock, even the roots of perennial herbs. When spring finally came, there was nothing left to sow. Fields lay fallow, and what few crops sprouted were devoured by wildlife, grown bold from hunger. Wolves descended into villages, scavenging corpses left unburied in frozen ground. In the Alps, entire terraces of vineyards died off, their caretakers too weak to tend them. It could take a decade for a community to recover its agricultural memory, the lost knowledge of which fields drained fastest, which apple varieties withstood frost. These weren't isolated tragedies. The Baltic famine of 1314, the Scottish ill years of the 1690s, the French Grand Hiver of 1709, each followed the same dreadful script. First came the weather, an ice storm in May, a summer without sun. Then the desperate measures, bark bread, leather soup, cannibalism whispered about in parish registers. Finally, the reckoning population crashes so severe that tax collectors skipped entire villages, finding only empty huts and scattered bones. Yet within this darkness flickered resilience. Some communities developed famine foods, plants normally considered inedible but boiled into survival stews, fern roots, acorns leached of bitterness, even certain lichens. In Norway, farmers buried emergency cheeses, rock-hard wheels of aged dairy packed in pine boxes and hidden like treasure. And when all else failed, there was migration. Whole villages would take to the roads, becoming winter walkers, following rumors of areas less ravaged. A Swiss chronicle describes a band of peasants arriving at a monastery, not to beg, but to offer their labor in exchange for the right to die on consecrated ground. The lesson of these famine years wasn't just about hunger, it was about fragility. A single bad harvest could be endured. 2 strained the limits of ingenuity. 3 broke societies apart. Modern food systems have buffers medieval peasants couldn't dream of, but the underlying truth remains. Civilization is always just 9 meals away from anarchy. Those farmers staring into empty granaries understood something we've forgotten, that full bellies aren't a given, but a fleeting victory wrested from nature's grip, one season at a time. Winter wasn't just a battle against hunger and cold. It was a war waged on the body itself. Imagine waking to find your gums swollen and purple. your teeth loosening in their sockets as you spat blood into the snow. Scurvy didn't care if you were a lord or a peasant. When winter stretched too long and fresh greens vanished, vitamin C deficiency became the silent killer lurking in every darkened cottage. But medieval farmers didn't just suffer passively. They fought back with an arsenal of herbal knowledge passed down through generations. Pine needles, rich in the very nutrients their bodies craved, were steeped into bitter teas. Crushed rose hips from autumn hedgerows were mixed with honey into sticky pastes, their tangy sweetness masking the rot setting into starving mouths. Even dandelion roots, dug stubbornly from frozen ground, were roasted and brewed as a last-ditch defense against the bleeding disease. Respiratory infections were winter's other relentless scourge. Damp thatch roofs bred mold, while smoky hearths filled homes with acrid plumes that seared lungs already weakened by cold. A simple cough could spiral into winter fever, likely pneumonia, with no antibiotics to halt its progress. Here too, nature offered desperate solutions. Thyme gathered in summer and dried in bunches hung from rafters was boiled into syrups to soothe ragged throats. Elderberries fermented into cordials became primitive antivirals, their effectiveness now confirmed by modern science. In the Alps, farmers inhaled steam from pots of water infused with juniper branches, creating makeshift decongestants. Some remedies walked the line between medicine and magic. Onions sliced in half and placed beneath beds were believed to draw out infection, a practice that may have had some merit, as their antimicrobial vapors could ease breathing. More unsettling was the urine cure for frostbite, where limbs were soaked in warm human urine to restore circulation. Manuscripts from Norse settlements describe wrapping sore throats in cloths soaked with fermented mare's milk, the lactic acid perhaps acting as a crude disinfectant. The true test of these remedies came in their absence. Records from the plague years reveal villages where entire families perished, not from the Black Death itself, but from the winter illnesses that followed bodies too weakened by scurvy or bronchitis to resist infection. A Norfolk priest's diary from 1348 describes finding a cottage where a mother and 3 children lay dead, their mouths stuffed with moss. Not a burial rite, but a final futile attempt to staunch bleeding gums. Yet for all their suffering, medieval peasants grasped a truth we often forget. Health was inseparable from the land. Every herb gathered in summer, every berry dried in autumn, was a calculated investment in winter survival. When modern researchers analyzed the contents of a 9th century healer's pouch found in a Danish bog, they discovered yarrow for fevers, chamomile for inflammation, and even traces of willow bark, nature's aspirin. This wasn't superstition. It was the slow, hard-won science of observation, refined through centuries of trial and fatal error. The cruelest twist, the poorest often held the deepest knowledge. While wealthy lords bled themselves for humoral balance, peasants relied on nettle tonics to stave off anemia, or chewed spruce resin to clean their teeth when winter stripped them of fresh greens. In Ireland, coastal families avoided scurvy altogether by harvesting dulse seaweed, a vitamin C goldmine, while inlanders suffered. Health wasn't just luck. It was geography, timing, and the brutal calculus of who had preserved what before the snows came. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the Christmas carols we still sing. The Holly and the Ivy isn't just a pretty tune, it's a coded herbal guide. Holly's berries warned of toxicity, while ivy's clinging vines symbolized perseverance against winter's grip. Even mistletoe, now a kissing bough, was once hung over cradles as protection against winter vapors. These weren't decorations. They were a desperate poetry of survival, turning every festive spray into a reminder of nature's dual power to kill and to cure. When we pop vitamin C tablets or dose ourselves with cough syrup today, we're continuing a war medieval farmers fought with far fewer weapons. Their suffering shaped our traditions, their ingenuity our medicine cabinets. Every time we drink a cup of herbal tea or hang a wreath on our door, we're unknowingly paying homage to ancestors who stared down winter's darkness and whispered, "Not this time." When fields lay frozen and livestock huddled in barns, medieval farmers didn't just sit idle. They turned their cottages into workshops, transforming raw materials into tradable goods. Winter became the season of the shuttle and the lathe, where calloused hands that typically gripped plows now mastered the delicate art of weaving wool into cloth or carving wood into tools. This wasn't hobbycraft, it was a survival economy, where every woven blanket or whittled spoon could be bartered for grain when the pantry ran bare. Take wool, for example. Sheep sheared in spring left farmers with sacks of raw fleece, too coarse to sell as is. But during winter's long nights, families carded, spun, and wove it into sturdy fabric. Simple looms stood by hearths, their rhythmic clacking keeping time with the wind outside. Finished cloth wasn't just for warmth, it was currency. Market records from York show peasants trading homespun for salt or seed grain, with quality measured in handsbreadths. The tighter the weave, the more it fetched. Some villages specialized. Flanders became famous for its woolens, while Lincolnshire weavers produced linsey woolsey, a mixed fabric prized for durability. Even scraps had value. Raveled threads could be spliced into fishing nets or wound into candle wicks. Woodworking offered another lifeline. With forests inaccessible under snow, farmers relied on stockpiled timber to carve essentials: butter churns, rake teeth, even wooden nails. But the real profit lay in luxury items: bowls turned on foot-powered lathes, their surfaces polished smooth with Horstel reeds. A well-made yew-wood spoon might trade for a week's worth of flour. In Scandinavia, artisans carved trencher plates from maple, their slightly concave surfaces perfect for holding stews. These weren't just utensils, they were biodegradable insurance policies. Blacksmiths faced unique challenges. Forge fires had to burn hotter to combat winter's chill, requiring careful rationing of precious charcoal. Yet demand surged for their skills. Plows needed repair before spring, and every household wanted fresh nails to patch roofs battered by storms. Some smiths pivoted to small goods: fish hooks forged from scrap iron, or bronze cloak pins shaped like animals to tempt wealthier buyers. Account books from Burgundy reveal smiths accepting payment in kind: a day's work for a sack of cabbages, a new axe head in exchange for mucking out the forge with manure. The darkest months also birthed seasonal specialties. In the Alps, farmers whittled intricate candle cages from green wood. As the wood dried, it warped into decorative patterns, holding tallow candles that lit midwinter feasts. Baltic families wove reeds into snowshoes or baskets, their tightly coiled designs waterproofed with pine pitch. Even children contributed, twisting rushes into candle holders or braiding straw into winter shoes lined with wool. These items flooded February markets, where traders from less crafty regions exchanged barrels of apples or wheels of cheese for goods they couldn't produce themselves. The system wasn't without exploitation. Wealthy merchants often underpaid for peasant crafts, knowing desperation drove sales. A surviving contract from Lombardy shows a linen weaver receiving just 3 bushels of rye for 50 yards of cloth, enough to feed a family for weeks, but far below the fabric's true value. Some lords demanded a cut of winter craft earnings, citing feudal dues. Yet despite the inequities, this cottage industry kept entire communities afloat. When spring finally came, it wasn't just the thaw they celebrated, It was the quiet triumph of having traded their way through winter's grasp, one carefully crafted item at a time. What's often overlooked is how these crafts preserved knowledge. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to spin flax wasn't just passing time. She was ensuring the family's future bartering power. Patterns woven into cloth or carvings, etched into wood, carried hidden meanings, symbols for fertility or protection, nods to pagan roots beneath Christian surfaces. Even the humblest wooden bowl held generations of observation. Which woods resisted cracking, which grains took the cleanest edge. Modern hobbyists, reviving these crafts, touch only the surface. Today's weaving or wood carving lacks the life or death urgency of a medieval winter, where crooked stitches might mean a child's hunger. Yet in every hand-woven basket or hand-forged hook, we glimpse the stubborn ingenuity of people who refuse to let winter silence their productivity. Their legacy isn't just in museums, it's in the very idea that creativity can be currency, and that human hands, no matter how cold, can always shape something from nothing. When rivers froze solid enough to walk on, medieval farmers didn't see barren ice. They saw a stocked pantry hidden beneath the surface. Ice fishing wasn't a leisurely pastime. It was a high-stakes operation requiring precision and patience. First came the cutting. A hole chopped through ice, sometimes 3 feet, thick with specialized tools like iron-tipped ice chisels or weighted ice spades. But brute force wasn't enough. Fishermen learned to read the ice's opacity. Clear patches signaled weak spots, while milky sections promised safety. The holes were kept small, both to conserve body heat and to prevent livestock from stumbling into them. Then came the waiting, often in handmade shelters of woven branches and hides, where a single line baited with salted meat or shiny metal lures dangled into the dark water below. The real trick lay in knowing where to drill. Experienced fishermen mapped underwater contours from memory, the deep eddies where pike lurked, the shallow shelves where perch schooled. Some used primitive sounders, dropping weighted ropes to gauge depth. In Scandinavia, traditions held that fish congregated near underwater springs, which stayed slightly warmer and oxygen-rich. Fishermen would plant evergreen boughs through their holes not for decoration, but to create shaded areas that attracted fish seeking cover. And when the bite was slow, they'd jig the line rhythmically, mimicking struggling insects to trigger strikes. A good haul wasn't just food, it was barter. Frozen fish traded well for grain or wool at winter markets, their flesh still fresh beneath the ice. Hunting in winter demanded a different kind of cunning. While some predators like wolves grew bolder in the snow, most game animals either migrated or hibernated, forcing hunters to adapt. Tracking became an art form. A lone deer's hoofprint in fresh snow told stories. The depth of the impression revealed its weight, the spacing between steps its speed. Hunters followed disturbed snow where rabbits had burrowed or scratched at bark, their usual forage buried. In the Alps, hunters built snow tunnels, narrow trenches leading to baited traps, to catch mountain hares whose white coats made them nearly invisible otherwise. But the most controversial prey were hibernating animals. Bears, badgers, and even dormice were dug from their dens, a practice walking the line between necessity and cruelty. Medieval hunting manuals describe using smoke to drive bears from caves, then dispatching them with spears as they staggered, groggy from interrupted sleep. The meat was stringy and strong-flavored, but fat-rich, a precious commodity when calories were scarce. Badgers, with their thick winter pelts and meat high in protein, were similarly targeted, their burrows located by tracking melted snow above their breathing holes. Even seemingly insignificant catches mattered. Dormice, considered delicacies since Roman times, were hunted by tapping on hollow trees to locate their nests, then extracted with hooked sticks. Every ounce of meat counted. The ethics of winter hunting sparked debate even then. Church records from Bavaria show priests condemning the hunting of pregnant hibernators, calling it a sin against creation's rhythm. Some villages imposed seasonal bans to protect breeding stocks, while others turned a blind eye to desperation. The brutality was undeniable, but so was the pragmatism. A single bear could provide enough rendered fat to waterproof boots, fuel lamps, and supplement diets for weeks. Nothing went to waste. Sinews became thread, bladders held stored grains, and bones were carved into needles or boiled for glue. What's often overlooked is the silent partnership between hunter and hunted. Medieval hunters practiced a form of ecological balance centuries before the term existed. They knew killing every hare or pike would doom future winters, so they followed unwritten rules, taking only what was needed, sparing young breeders, even scattering grain for struggling game during the harshest months. This wasn't sentimentality, it was long-term survival strategy. Ice patterns, migration routes, hibernation cycles. These were more than just knowledge. They were the difference between sustenance and starvation, written not in books, but in the tracks left on fresh snow. Forests were not just woodlands to medieval farmers. They were winter larders, pharmacies, and contested battlegrounds rolled into one. When fields lay barren and grain stores dwindled, the skeletal trees offered a last resort. Acorns could be leached of their bitterness and ground into flour, while beech nuts provided precious fats. Birch bark, stripped in careful vertical sheets to avoid killing the tree, became both kindling and emergency food, boiled into a weak but sustaining broth when nothing else remained. Even the humble lichen clinging to oak trunks found use. Iceland moss, though vile tasting, could be soaked and baked into crude crackers that staved off starvation. Foraging rights were fiercely regulated, a tangled web of feudal laws and local customs. Noble forests often bore stern warnings. Vert and venison laws punished peasants caught taking so much as a fallen branch without permission. Court rolls from Nottinghamshire detail fines for gathering firewood, by hook or by crook. A phrase born from the tools allowed, a blunt hook for pulling down dead wood, but no axes or saws. Yet villages bordering royal hunting grounds developed clever workarounds. In Germany's Black Forest, families sent children to collect wall-strew leaf litter for livestock bedding, while secretly stuffing their cloaks with hidden mushrooms or hazelnuts. Some manors allowed pannage, the right to let pigs forage for acorns in autumn, but demanded every 10th pig as payment, turning forests into grim accounting ledgers. Mushrooms became both salvation and Russian roulette. Without modern field guides, farmers relied on generational wisdom to distinguish edible mauls from deadly false mauls. Folklore warned of fairy rings, circles of mushrooms believed to mark dangerous enchantments, though we now know them as natural fungal growth patterns. In Slavic regions, certain polypore fungi were called winter bread, dried and ground into flour when grain ran out. But desperation sometimes overrode caution. Chronicles from the famine of 1310 describe entire families perishing after eating toxic mushrooms, their bodies found clutching half-eaten caps in stiffened hands. The most controversial forage was inner bark specifically, the nutrient-rich cambium layer beneath rough outer bark. Scraped from pines or elms, it could be dried and pounded into meal. Swedish farmers called it bark bread, mixing it with whatever scant rye remained to stretch supplies. But stripping bark killed trees, sparking violent clashes between hungry peasants and foresters. A Danish law from 1420 imposed hand amputation for repeat offenders. while Swiss alpine communities designated specific famine trees for communal stripping, marking them with red paint to concentrate damage. Herbal knowledge turned forests into apothecaries. Juniper berries, pungent and blue-black, were chewed to ward off scurvy or steeped in gin as a primitive antiseptic. Pine needle tea provided vitamin C, while willow twigs became nature's aspirin, chewed to ease the aches of winter labor. Women bundled dried yarrow and chamomile into linen sachets, hanging them by hearths where winter coughs lingered thickest. But this wisdom carried risks. Church authorities often conflated herbalism with witchcraft, leading to tragic cases like the 1320 trial of a French healer accused of forest magic after saving a village with lungwort lichen. The true tension lay in competing visions of the forest. To lords, it was a private hunting preserve and timber reserve. To peasants, it was a communal lifeline, where every snapped twig might mean survival. This clash birthed Europe's first environmental protests, like the 1381 Brenner Rebellion, where alpine villagers disguised in bark masks sabotaged noble hunting lodges to reclaim foraging ground. Laws eventually adapted. England's Charter of the Forest in 1217 granted peasants limited gathering rights, a recognition that starving subjects made poor laborers. What seems like simple foraging was actually a high-stakes negotiation with power, nature, and ethics. Every acorn gathered carried the weight of potential punishment. Every mushroom picked the risk of poison. Forests weren't just ecosystems, they were theaters of silent defiance, where the crack of a broken branch underfoot might signal trespass or triumph, depending on who was listening. Winter in a medieval village had no room for idle hands, not even small ones. From the moment children could walk, they were folded into the intricate choreography of survival, their tasks as vital as any adults. A 5-year-old might seem too young to shoulder responsibility, but in the depths of January, even tiny fingers could mean the difference between a cow's survival or starvation. Imagine a child barely tall enough to reach a manger, carefully spreading hay into thin, even layers so no animal wasted a single stalk. This wasn't just feeding livestock, it was teaching resourcefulness, one handful of fodder at a time. Older children took on more complex roles. Girls as young as 7 mastered the drop spindle, twisting raw wool into thread by the dim light of rush candles. Every length of yarn they produced would become socks to prevent frostbite or tunics to block the wind. Boys learned to mend rabbit snares or whittle wooden pegs for repairing barn doors battered by storms. In regions where flax was spun into linen, children's small hands were prized for teasing out the delicate fibers without breaking them, a skill so valued that apprenticeship contracts specified finger dexterity as a prerequisite. But winter chores weren't just about labor. They were lessons in brutal arithmetic. A child sent to gather firewood wasn't simply collecting sticks. They were calculating which branches burned longest versus which smoked too much for cramped interiors. In the Alps, children assigned to carry hay to high pastures learned to pack it in precise snow tunnels to prevent avalanches, their footsteps tamping paths that would guide sheep come spring. Even play had purpose. Stacking firewood became a counting game. The rows tallied aloud like multiplication tables. The darkest months also held specialized tasks only children could perform. Their small frames slipped easily into cramped henhouses to collect eggs before they froze, or under low eaves to stuff cracks with moss. In coastal Norway, children were sent across frozen fjords as messengers, their light weight less likely to break thin ice. And when blizzards buried homes, it was often children who tunneled through drifts to check on elderly neighbors, their bodies more expendable if a snowbank collapsed. Some chores crossed into folklore. In Brittany, girls baked soul cakes during the winter solstice. Their ingredients whispered to carry prayers for the dead. Slavic boys carried bundles of straw to scatter on icy paths, a tradition said to please frost spirits. These weren't just tasks. They were rituals weaving the next generation into the fabric of communal survival. A child who helped hang protective rowan branches over a barn door wasn't just following orders. They were inheriting a language of symbols older than Christianity. The line between work and education blurred entirely in winter. A teenager carding wool by the hearth wasn't just preparing fiber. They were absorbing the cadence of village gossip, learning which families had surplus grain or whose cellar had flooded. Even toddlers played with carved wooden animals, arranging them in imaginary pastures that mirrored next year's grazing plans. Every chore, no matter how small, carried the weight of continuity, proof that survival wasn't a single winter's feat, but a chain of knowledge passed hand to small hand across the centuries. Yet for all their contributions, children bore winter's cruelty most acutely. Skeletal remains from mass graves show stunted growth lines in bones, evidence of malnutrition halting development during harsh years. Diaries from monastery orphanages describe chilblained fingers still expected to spin thread, or cough-racked boys tending fires through the night. The very qualities that made children useful, their smallness, their energy, also made them vulnerable. When famine struck, they were often the first to succumb, their bodies too fragile to endure what adults could scrape through. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the toys they left behind. Archaeologists excavating medieval middens find dolls stuffed with straw, tiny wooden sleds, and marbles made from frozen clay, proof that even in winter's grip, children carved out spaces for joy. A spinning top isn't just a toy. It's a testament to resilience, a declaration that survival wasn't merely about enduring, but about ensuring the next generation remembered how to play. In the end, that may have been their most vital task of all, keeping alive the idea that spring would come. And with it, a world where laughter didn't have to be rationed like salt. Medieval farmers didn't have weather apps or satellite forecasts. They had something far more intimate. A language of signs written in the flight of birds, the ache of old bones, and the slow turn of the stars. Predicting winter's fury wasn't just curiosity. It was a matter of life and death, and their methods blended sharp observation with centuries of hard-won folklore. Almanacs were the closest thing to a farmer's winter survival guide, scribbled in margins by monks, or passed down through generations as memorized rhymes. The shepherd's calendar, popular in England, warned that if oak trees bore more acorns than usual, a bitter winter was coming, nature's way of ensuring wildlife had extra food. But these weren't just rustic proverbs. There was science hidden in them. Abundant mast crops like acorns or beech nuts often do precede harsh winters, as trees respond to environmental stressors by producing more seeds. Farmers also tracked the thickness of onion skins or the fur on caterpillars' thicker layers, signaling a need for extra insulation against the cold. Even the way spiders wove webs changed. Tight, dense patterns were said to forecast heavy snow. Animal behavior was another living barometer. Swallows fleeing early or squirrels frantically burying nuts, deeper than usual, sent villages into a flurry of preparation. In Scandinavia, farmers watched reindeer. If their hooves grew thick fur prematurely, it meant the earth would freeze solid soon. Birds flying low or cattle huddling together in the pasture weren't just random acts. They were chapters in a survival manual written by instinct. Some signs crossed into the uncanny. Welsh herdsmen believed if sheep gathered on the eastern side of a hill, A mild winter would follow, but if they crowded westward, blizzards were coming. The reasoning, prevailing winds shaped their choices, an early lesson in microclimate tracking. Then there were the stars. Medieval astrology wasn't about horoscopes. It was a farmer's practical astronomy. The position of the moon during the autumn equinox was scrutinized. A waxing moon in Aries promised a dry winter, while one in Pisces warned of floods. The labors of the month's manuscripts, illustrated in monasteries, often depicted November as a time for stargazing, not just slaughtering livestock. Certain constellations, like the Pleiades, were thought to tug at the weather. If they shone unusually bright, frost would bite early. Even the color of the sunrise on St. Martin's Day, November 11th, was a portent. A red sky meant snow, while a pale yellow hinted at a green winter with rain instead of ice. But the most haunting predictors were the ones written in human flesh. Elderly villagers, their joints creaking like old floorboards, were living weather vanes. When their arthritis flared, it signaled a drop in air pressure, often before the first snow. Grandmother's knee knows more than the almanac, went a German saying. Others listened to the dead. Graves cracking open in churchyards weren't just eerie sights. They were warnings that the ground had frozen too deeply, too soon, a sign that spring would come late. The irony, many of these methods held kernels of truth. Animals do sense pressure changes. Trees do react to climate patterns. What medieval farmers lacked in technology, they made up for in hyperlocal, generational wisdom. A modern meteorologist might scoff at the idea of predicting snow by counting goose fat layers, but they'd also admit, when survival's on the line, you read every page of nature's book, even the ones written in goose feathers and old bones. This wasn't superstition, it was data collection, medieval style. And in a world where one wrong guess could empty granaries or freeze flocks solid, farmers became the original weather models, their predictions etched not in algorithms, but in the collective memory of those who'd learned to listen when the wind spoke. Centuries may have passed, but the fingerprints of medieval winter survival are all around us, sometimes hiding in plain sight. Take root cellaring, that underground pantry technology perfected by peasants. Today it's rebranded as modern homesteading, with YouTube tutorials teaching urban gardeners how to bury buckets of carrots in sand, just like 13th century farmers did. The difference, now we use plastic bins instead of willow baskets, and climate-controlled sensors replace the old trick of dropping a candle into the cellar. If the flame died, oxygen was too low. Even industrial food storage owes a debt. Massive refrigerated warehouses operate on the same principle medieval peasants grasped, that Earth's stable temperatures slow decay. Communal resilience, too, echoes through time. Medieval villages pooling grain reserves and sharing labor find their parallel in today's community freezers during blizzards or neighborhood tool libraries. The Icelandic winter lights tradition, where households kept candles burning in windows to guide travelers, morphed into modern snow angel programs checking on elderly neighbors during storms. And those strict medieval rules about firewood quotas, they're not so different from suburban homeowners associations fining residents who skip shoveling sidewalks. Both recognize that one person's negligence risks the whole community's safety. Some adaptations are startlingly literal. Norwegian farmers who buried butter in bogs for preservation would nod in recognition at today's trendy fermented foods movement, where sauerkraut and kvass flood health food stores. The science is identical. Lactic acid bacteria creating an inhospitable environment for pathogens. Even medieval tree hay, dried branches fed to livestock, has a hipster revival as browse fodder in regenerative agriculture circles. Yet the most profound legacy isn't in techniques, but in mindset. When modern preppers stockpile canned goods or install wood stoves, they're channeling the same visceral understanding medieval farmers had. That comfort is temporary, and survival demands proactive effort. Supermarket shelves emptied during the pandemic revealed how thin our civilized veneer really is within days. People were relearning medieval skills like preserving eggs in salt lime water or rendering fat for candle making. The twist: technology hasn't erased vulnerability. It's just changed the stakes. Medieval peasants feared the hungry gap of late winter when stores ran low. Today, we worry about power grids failing during ice storms. But the solution remains oddly familiar: diversification. Just as medieval farmers planted multiple crop varieties to hedge against failure, off-grid solar systems now pair with propane backups. The same principle of never relying on a single lifeline. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what we've forgotten. Medieval villages maintained famine foods, last resort edibles like acorns or lichen. Most modern urbanites wouldn't recognize them. Yet when wildfires or floods cut off supply chains, that lost knowledge suddenly matters. Indigenous groups preserving these traditions, like the Sami with their reindeer, moss bread, aren't just keeping history alive. They're safeguarding survival blueprints we may need again. The next time you see a farm-to-table restaurant serving fermented pickles, or a community garden trading harvests, you're witnessing a continuum. Those medieval farmers staring down winter's abyss would barely recognize our world, but they'd understand the stubborn human spirit behind these choices. Survival isn't about the tools. It's about the willingness to adapt, share, and prepare. Some threads of wisdom, it seems, are too vital to ever fully unravel. Hollywood would have us believe medieval winters were all roaring hearths, steaming mugs of mead, and boar feasts under snow-dusted castle arches. The reality: more like chapped hands splitting open on frozen plough handles, and teeth chattering through another meal of thin barley gruel. The romantic image of endless Yuletide revelry crumbles under the weight of historical records, like the account from a 12th century English monk who described peasants so malnourished by February they chewed on roofing thatch for the trace nutrients in mold. Take the myth of constant winter feasting. While Christmas and Twelfth Night did provide respite, these were brief islands of excess in an ocean of scarcity. Most peasants survived on what we'd now consider starvation rations: 2 pounds of coarse bread and a pint of weak ale per day, supplemented with whatever pickled vegetables hadn't spoiled. The famous wassail bowls of spiced wine. Reserved for manor halls, peasants drank small beer, brewed from the third rinsing of grain, so weak it wouldn't intoxicate a child. Even the much romanticized Yule log was practical first. Festive second, its slow burn meant one less night chopping firewood in the deadly cold. The labor never ceased. Snow didn't pause the endless cycle of mucking stables, hauling water from frozen wells, or chiseling ice from troughs. Livestock demanded care even when temperatures plunged. A diary from Burgundy describes a farmer losing 3 fingers to frostbite while delivering a calf in a blizzard. Women's work grew more brutal, spinning flax in unheated rooms left hands so stiff they couldn't grip spoons, while laundry done with lye and frozen water turned forearms into cracked, bleeding landscapes. Archaeological evidence reveals arthritic deformities in medieval skeletons far exceeding modern rates, with spinal damage from years of hunching over indoor fires. Then there's the dirty secret of medieval hygiene. Forget steaming baths, water froze in wash basins, and most peasants wore the same woolens for months, their linens crawling with lice. Church records scold congregations for the stench of unwashed bodies mingling with rancid tallow candles. The romantic winter snuggles by the fire. More likely a family of 6 sharing one flea-infested blanket, their breath visible in the perpetual chill. The disconnect stems from whose stories survived. Illuminated manuscripts depict lords feasting because they were commissioned by those lords. Peasant realities emerge in tax rolls listing deaths from winter fever, pneumonia, or court cases where starving families stole livestock, feed to bake into bread. A 13th century Italian physician noted the poor developed a distinctive blue tint to their skin from constant cold exposure. No golden firelit glow there. Even winter's supposed downtime was a myth. Dark months were when tools were repaired, wool carded and contracts renegotiated, all by dim rushlight. The famed Wheel of the Year wasn't some pagan calendar of leisure. It was an unrelenting schedule where mending one fence in January meant not facing starvation when spring planting stalled. Modern experiments recreating medieval winters show calorie burn rates comparable to Arctic explorers. Peasants weren't lounging. They were fighting for every breath. What's lost in the romanticizing is the raw ingenuity behind mere survival. That quaint straw-filled mattress, designed to trap body heat, the charming tradition of hanging herbs. Desperate germ control in sick rooms. Every surviving custom carries the shadow of choices made at the edge of human endurance. The real medieval winter wasn't a fairy tale. It was the original survival thriller where the price of failure wasn't a commercial break, but an unmarked grave under the frost. Medieval farmers didn't just endure winter. They waged a quiet revolution against it, turning scarcity into innovation and isolation into communal strength. Every salted barrel of meat, every stitch of lanolin-soaked wool, every carefully banked fire wasn't just survival, it was defiance. They transformed barns into workshops, forests into pharmacies, and superstitions into systems, proving resilience isn't about brute force, but about adaptation. These were people who looked at a frozen river and saw a fishing hole, at a blizzard and plotted next year's irrigation, at a starving child and carved a wooden toy to keep hope alive. Their legacy isn't just in the techniques they invented, root cellars, hotbeds, fermented foods, but in the mindset they forged. That preparation is power, community is currency, and even the harshest winter can be outsmarted. What's humbling is how much we've forgotten. Modern life has insulated us from the rhythms they mastered, the art of preserving without plastics, warming without watts, healing without pharmacies. Yet their wisdom echoes in our pandemic pantries, our off-grid solar panels, even our weekend gardening. They'd laugh at the irony that we now pay premiums for artisanal foods they invented to avoid starvation, or that we study their methods not out of necessity, but nostalgia. But perhaps their greatest lesson was this: survival isn't solitary. Those medieval villages thrived because they understood that shared labor lightens burdens, that a neighbor's full granary is your insurance, that winter's bite is blunted by collective warmth. In an age of digital isolation, their model feels radical. A reminder that community isn't just comfort, but survival's bedrock. So the next time you complain about a snow day or stock up for a storm, tip your hat to those medieval farmers. They wrote the playbook we still follow, one frostbitten finger at a time. Now we'd love to hear from you. What historical survival skill fascinates you most? Could you imagine brewing beer for vitamins or fermenting cabbage in a barrel? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're hungry for more mysteries of the past, hit subscribe. After all, history isn't just about dates and wars, it's about the extraordinary ordinary people who fought the coldest battles with nothing but grit and ingenuity. Their winter is over, ours, well, that's still being written.